difficulty. Now, what do you say?" I said that I would come to him at the Battery early in the morning. "Say, Lord, strike you dead if you don't," said the man. I said so, and he took me down. Good night, sir," I faltered. "Much of that," said he, glancing about him over the cold, wet flat. "I wish I was a frog or an eel." He limped towards the church wall, and he looked in my young eyes as if he were eluding the hands of the dead people. When I saw him turning, I was frightened again and ran home without stopping. My sister, Mrs. Jo Gargery, was more than 20 years older than I, and had established a great reputation with the neighbours because she'd brought me up by hand. Knowing her to have a hard and heavy hand, and to be much in the habit of laying it upon her husband as well as upon me, I supposed that Jo Gargery and I were both brought up by hand. She was not a good-looking woman, my sister, and I had a general impression that she must have made Jo Gargery marry her by hand. Jo was a fair man, with eyes of such a very undecided blue that they seemed to have somehow got mixed with their own whites. He was a sweet-tempered, easy-going, dear fellow. When I ran home from the churchyard, Jo was sitting alone in the kitchen. "Mrs. Jo has been out a dozen times looking for you, Pip. She's out now, making it a baker's dozen." "Is she?" "Yes, Pip," said Jo, "and what's worse, she's got Tickler with her." Tickler was a wax-ended piece of cane worn smooth by collision with my tickled frame. "Pip, she's a-comin'. Get behind the door, old chap." Mrs. Jo, throwing the door wide open, and finding an obstruction behind it, immediately applied Tickler to its further investigation. She concluded by throwing me, I often served as a connubial missile, at Jo, who passed me onto the chimney and quietly fenced me up there with his great leg. "Where have you been, you young monkey?" said Mrs. Jo. "I've only been to the churchyard," said I, crying and rubbing myself. "Churchyard!" repeated my sister. "You'll drive me to the churchyard betwixt you one of these days." As she applied herself to the tea things, Jo peeped down at me over his leg. It was Christmas Eve, and I had to stir the pudding for next day with a copper stick from 7 to 8 by the Dutch clock. "Hark," said I, when I'd done my stirring. "Was that great guns, Jo?" "Ah," said Jo, "there's another convict off. There was a convict off last night after sunset gun." If I slept at all that night, it was only to imagine myself drifting down the river on a strong spring tide to the prison hulks. As soon as the great black velvet pall outside my little window was shot with grey, I got up and went downstairs, every crack in every board calling after me, "Stop thief!" I stole some bread, some rind of cheese, about half a jar of mincemeat, some brandy from a stone bottle, diluting the stone bottle from a jug in the kitchen cupboard, a meat bone, and a beautiful pork pie. I got a file from among Jo's tools, then I ran for the misty marshes. I had just crossed a ditch when I saw the man sitting before me. He was nodding forward, heavy with sleep. I touched him on the shoulder. He instantly jumped up, and it was not the same man. And yet this man was dressed in coarse grey too, and had a great iron on his leg. He swore an oath at me, made a hit at me that missed, and then ran into the mist. "It's the young man," I thought, feeling my heart shoot as I identified him. I dare say I should have felt a pain in my liver too, if I'd known where it was. I was soon at the Battery after that, and there was the right man. I opened the bundle and emptied my pockets. "What's in the bottle, boy?" "Brandy." He was gobbling mincemeat, meat bone, bread, cheese, and pork pie all at once, and often stopping, even stopping his jaws, to listen. "I'm afraid you won't leave any of it for him," said I, timidly. "Who's him?" said my friend, stopping in his crunching of pie crust. "The young man that was hid with you." "Oh, ah," he returned with something like a gruff laugh. "Him? Yes, yes. He don't want no whittles." "I thought he looked as if he did," said I. The man regarded me with the keenest scrutiny. "Where?" "Yonder," said I, pointing. "I found him nodding asleep and thought it was you. Didn't you hear the cannon last night?" "Why, see now," said he, "when a man's alone on these flats, perishing of cold and want, he hears nothing all night but guns firing and voices calling. But this man, did you notice anything in him?" "He had a badly bruised face," said I. He crammed what little food was left into the breast of his grey jacket. "Show me the way he went. Give us hold of the file, boy." I indicated in what direction the mist had shrouded the other man, and he was down on the wet grass, filing at his iron like a madman. I told him I must go, but he took no notice. The last I heard of him, the file was still going. My sister, having so much to do, was going to church vicariously. That is to say, Joe and I were going. Mr. Wopsle, the clerk at church, was to dine with us, and Mr. Hubble, the wheelwright, and Mrs. Hubble, and Uncle Pumblechook, Joe's uncle, but Mrs. Joe appropriated him, who was a well-to-do corn chandler and drove his own chaise cart. When Joe and I got home, we found the table laid, and Mrs. Joe dressed, and the dinner dressing, and the front door unlocked. It never was at any other time, for the company to enter by. And still, not a word about the robbery. The time came, without bringing with it any relief to my feelings, and the company came. I opened the door first to Mr. Wopsle, united to a Roman nose and a large, shining, bald forehead. He had a deep voice, which he was uncommonly proud of. Next, to Mr. and Mrs. Hubble, and last of all to Uncle Pumblechook. Note well, I was not allowed to call him uncle, under the severest penalties. "Mrs. Joe," said Uncle Pumblechook, a large, hard-breathing, middle-aged, slow man with a mouth like a fish and dull, staring eyes. "I have brought you, as the compliments of the season, I have brought you, Mum, a bottle of sherry wine, and I have brought you, Mum, a bottle of port wine." Every Christmas he presented himself with exactly the same words. Among this good company I should have felt myself, even if I hadn't robbed the pantry, in a false position. They seemed to think the opportunity lost if they failed to point the conversation at me every now and then and stick the point into me. It began the moment we sat down to dinner. Mr. Wopsle said grace with theatrical declamation, and ended with a very proper aspiration that we might be truly grateful. Upon which my sister fixed me with her eyes and said in a low, reproachful voice, "Do you hear that? Be grateful." "Especially," said Mr. Pumblechook, "be grateful, boy, to them which brought you up by hand." Joe's station and influence were something feebler, if possible, when there was company. But he always aided and comforted me in some way of his own, and he always did so at dinner-time by giving me gravy, if there was any. There being plenty today, Joe spooned into my plate about half a pint. A little later on, Mr. Wopsle reviewed the sermon with some severity, and remarked that he considered the subject of the day's homily ill-chosen, which was the less excusable, he added, when there were so many subjects going about. "True," said Uncle Pumblechook, "plenty of subjects going about for them that know how to put salt upon their tails. Look at pork alone. There's a subject." "True, sir, many a moral for the young," returned Mr. Wopsle. "Swine were the companions of the prodigal. The gluttony of the swine is put before us as an example to the young." I thought this pretty well in him, who'd been praising up the pork for being so plump and juicy. "What is detestable in a pig is more detestable in a boy." Joe offered me more gravy, which I was afraid to take. "Yet," said Mr. Pumblechook, "pork, regarded as spiled, is rich too, ain't it?" "Have a little brandy, uncle," said my sister. Oh, heavens, it had come at last. He would find it was weak, he would say it was weak, and I was lost. My sister poured his brandy out. I saw the miserable creature throw his head back and drink the brandy off. Instantly afterwards, the company was seized with unspeakable consternation, owing to his springing to his feet and rushing out at the door, violently plunging and expectorating, apparently out of his mind. Mrs. Joe and Joe ran to him. It was a relief when he was brought back and sank down into his chair with the one significant gasp, "Tar!" I had filled up the bottle from the tar-water jug. "Tar?" cried my sister in amazement. "Why, however could tar come there?" But Uncle Pumblechook waved it all away and asked for hot gin and water. My sister had to employ herself in getting the gin, the hot water, the sugar, and the lemon peel, and mixing them. For the time at least, I was saved. Mr. Pumblechook partook of pudding. All partook of pudding. I began to think that I should get over the day when my sister said to Joe, "Clean plates, cold." I foresaw what was coming, and I felt that this time I really was gone. "You must taste," said my sister, "such a delightful and delicious present of Uncle Pumblechook's. It is a pie, a savoury pork pie." My sister went out to get it. I have never been absolutely certain whether I uttered a shrill yell of terror merely in spirit or in the bodily hearing of the company. I felt that I could bear no more and ran for my life. But I